All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Valli, for joining us this afternoon. I greatly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to do this video brief for the collaboration with the Association for Adult and Development and the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. Honor is mine. Yeah.
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you about multiculturalism and social justice and how you incorporate those concepts into your work. So first, I want if you could just talk about or describe the value of multiculturalism in the work that you do.
Absolutely. So my main identity is that of a counselor educator. So I train graduate students in clinical mental health program at Southern Oregon University. And something that I share with them is when we are not talking about culture, be that in our clinical work, be that in our research training, what we are doing is not existing in an acultural world, but we are existing in a white dominant cultural world. So if I'm talking about theories and not talking about how culture has impacted the development of our theories, what I'm basically doing is talking about theories developed in the white culture. I'm talking about family counseling, couples counseling, and not talking about intersectionality by Dr. Crenshaw, then I'm again talking about white families, heterosexist families, cisgender families. So the conversation on culture is not a perfunctory topic. It's not a checklist that I need to do as a counselor educator. It is a theme, it's a paradigm that needs to be infused in everything that I teach and train my students in and in my own work. So for me, multiculturalism, for me, culturally responsive approaches is foundational. It's the first thing I talk about, irrespective of the content that we are discussing. Multiculturalism is how we do it, and then the topic is what we are doing. So it's definitely an integral part of what I do, and I hope it remains that way in my future. Yeah.
Yeah, and wow, thank you so much. Because when you were talking about with theories and white dominant and how you think about our work, I was like, yes, that's important, but it's also something that we don't really educate or really educate our students from, as far as like the foundation of a lot of these theories and how these apply to various cultures.
Absolutely. And we engage in this othering when we talk about cultures. It's almost as if diverse communities exist out there in a different exotic island, but we all are cultural beings. And when we immediately, so even yesterday, we had a conversation on incorporating indigenous values in assessment, and my students were displaying their implicit bias saying, oh, this might apply to my client who identifies as Native, but why does this not apply to all of your clients? How can we not other conversations on multiculturalism and integrate that in our everyday practice?
Yes, I think that's very, very important about, how come we think about certain things as othering. This is what we have to do for these kinds of people, instead of for this is what we should be doing, no matter who is in our classroom, who comes to our session, who's supervision, supervisee or things like that too. So thank you for touching on those great points. My next question asks about what role does social justice play in your work?
Absolutely. And social justice and in highlighting the social injustices embedded into interpersonal and structural barriers is very important. So fortunately or otherwise, talking about culture, talking about social injustices is not an elective for individuals who identify as BIPOC. It is our lived reality. It's not a topic. It's not a seminar. It's not a webinar. It's the way of life in which historically minoritized communities communicate. So talking about social justice is not just an add-on. It's not something optional that my students and I need to do, the counselor education community needs to do, but it is a necessity. It is our professional duty to not just work with our clients on a one-on-one basis, but actively find ways to dismantle those barriers that are impacting their mental health. So my role as a counselor, my role as a counselor educator, and as a researcher is not to see individual symptoms of quote unquote dysfunctions, but relate how is this symptomatic of structural barriers, structural injustices that constantly create these very severe negative impact on the mental health. So that's definitely something, it's a foundation that is part of our code of ethics, part of our multicultural and social justice competencies. And it's our role as educators and as practitioners to bring it to life and engage in it, not as something supplementary we do, but as something primary, something of a requirement in our role.
Yeah, I'm like nodding in agreement because it does come across like social justice is this add-on component um, that we're supposed to do instead of for thinking about it as, like you said, the foundation of everything we should do. We should be thinking about these barriers, these challenges that have been set up to oppress our clients or to prevent our clients from getting the access that they need, and even with our students, because you talk about being counselor educators, and we're both counselor educators, but even in that work with our students as well, what are some of the barriers? And with COVID right now and everything that's going on, I know both of us can really relate to some of these barriers that our students are experience. So we need to be social justice needs to be at the foundation of that. So when you said that, I was like, yes, that is. It's not this afterthought. It's not this, oh, let me check this off. There's this training. Let me add this on to it. It should be infused in everything. And unfortunately, it comes across as an afterthought or an add-on, like you mentioned. So yeah, thank you. I didn't know if you had any additional comments about that. Sorry, I kind of went off, but I completely agree with what you were saying.
Thanks for the perspective, Dr. Bell. And I want to highlight, and maybe use this space that when we engage in social justice work, if we identify as individuals who are BIPOC or members of other historically marginalized communities, that's an emotional labor, unnecessary emotional labor that we are going through if people from dominant identities had chosen to do the work on their own. But it's a labor that we are going through, choosing to go through, and have been going through for so many generations, so many centuries. Um, and the unfortunate part is when members from dominant groups engage in social justice work, there's an expectation of reward, there's an expectation of pat on the back. Not for everyone, but I want us to engage in the necessary self-awareness, going back to the multicultural and social justice competencies. Where is my desire for reward coming from if I engage in that 2 webinars with 2 CEUs, or that one street advocacy work that I engage in? So it is not something, again, something supplementary and extra that we are doing. It is foundational, and it is a choice we made when we committed to the work of mental health.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you for that. My next question asks, why is it important to consider lifespan development when working with clients?
Right. So if we look deeper into the intersectionality framework by Kimberly Crenshaw, we realize that access to power, access to influence, access to privilege is definitely shaped by multiple cultural dimensions, including the power and privilege we ascribe to age. So the world we live in, age is impactful of how much influence we are able to have in our communities. Of course, very young children and people who are temporarily disabled or temporarily not able to have access to social communities cannot create the impact that people who are currently employed, currently engaging in powerful positions have. So age can give us an interesting opening in what is my responsibility to my generation, the generation after me, and the generation before me. So when we talk about age, when we talk about social justice work, we of course have to talk about, again, systemic barriers. So think about maybe paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave. If I'm not able to infuse values of social justice, infuse values of compassion as a parent, am I then creating more emotional burden for my child when they grow up, for them to continue to dismantle all these structures, facing maybe health barriers, education barriers, attachment barriers? So age gives us this unique sense of ongoingness, the continuity of our work. Our ancestors engaged in this work, created this platform for my generation, our generation to engage in. And deep down, we know this work needs to go on, will go on. So can I create a world? Can I actively contribute, knowing that my children, my community members, my nieces and nephews will one day be living? So it kind of breaks away this individualistic, self-centered approach to social justice and this individualistic buy-in. I need to talk about racial oppression because I am impacted by it or I'm not impacted by it. When I talk about life as a continuity, about people before and after me, I recognize this is a very sacred responsibility. This is a responsibility that I need to engage in so that people after me can live a better life, just like I'm benefiting from the fruits of labor that my forefathers engaged in. So I hope it creates this deeper sense of connectivity, deeper sense of responsibility in the social justice work we do when we talk about people before and after us.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned and how you talk about thinking about age and just thinking about like our ancestors and
Mhm.
the barriers that they dismantled for us to have the resources that we have right now, and us continuing to engage in that social justice work from a collective perspective, because sometimes we think about, some of us think more about like ourselves, but if we think about it collectively, we think about the people who came before us and then the people who come after us. And, and not just like our children or any, but just like you mentioned, community, like our community members, their families, the families of our families, you know, this is why because we want to set up a better world for
Right.
the individuals who come after us. That's a great point, and I really didn't think about it like that. So thank you for opening my mind to that perspective.
Of course, like I think one of the most ageist statement I've been hearing amidst the pandemic is, don't worry, it only impacts people who are older or who have a pre-existing condition. Well, they're valuable people too. They're an integral part of our society too. So almost this classification that we, the dominant age group, the age group with a lot more power, doesn't have to worry about the pandemic because it only affects, as though it's supposed to be a consolation of sorts. So human development helps us examine those internalized biases that's rooted in capitalism, that's rooted in ageism, and recognize that there is this selfishness that has permeated into our society, unfortunately.
Yes, agree with I agree with all of that. So thank you for opening my mind to that perspective, and it really just kind of gave me something to think about that I really hadn't considered. So thank you for that insight.
Of course.
Um, my last and final question asks, what are some concrete examples, about 2 to 3, that demonstrate how you incorporate multiculturalism and social justice across lifespan development as a professional counselor, educator, supervisor, and researcher? You did touch on some of that when you were talking about your students and assessments earlier, so I did want to give you an opportunity to elaborate more on those points and add any additional points that you want to make.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Dr. Bell. That's a great question. I'll share this with an example. This summer, I was teaching a family counseling course, and one of the most common assignments that's used is the family genogram. And we know it's a very sensitive, very tender assignment for many of us. And that was a very educational moment for me when one of my students, she identifies as Native American. And she told me that the genogram system that is currently in place, that's currently approved by experts, is not a structure that would work for her. Her family, their community's definition of cousins, their community's definition of elders, community's definition of what is biological family and what is chosen family goes beyond this dichotomous binary based thinking that we all have been socialized in. So that was a moment in which I realized that this assignment can actually be oppressive if I ask her to meet and fit into a structure that's not hers, and that actually robs her of the richness of her family. So I had to open up, and that was a learning moment. I had to go and research, and she educated me. Can I look at the genogram from more of an essay perspective while I continue to examine the patterns? So that's just one example in which there is space to talk about patterns that are transmitted through generations, patterns that are transmitted as a result of intersecting cultural identities. But that was a moment of a growth fostering relationship in which we both benefited and the learning expanded to meet the students' need. So that's an example of a counselor educator moment that comes to me when values of human development, values of social justice impacted that one assignment for sure. And my other main identity, an identity that I absolutely love and have fallen in love with, is my researcher identity. And like I said before, for many people who identify as historically marginalized, talking about culture, race, and intersectionality is something that comes with a lot of pride, but it's also a lot of emotional labor. And I talk about international students who also identify as persons of color as they are navigating through education systems in the US. There's a lot of colorism, racism, and of course, differences based on immigration status that I noticed for sure. And that has translated into my research work. And I've tried to really challenge this paternalistic patronizing attitude that we have towards international students as though they need to be rescued. So through my research, I've talked about the unique cultural capital, the cultural strengths that international students of color have, and what is it that the host country can learn from them, rather than expecting this group to fit into the needs and desires of a pre-existing oppressive framework. So it shows up in my research in terms of topic and how I engage in this work, and in my teaching as following the feminist pedagogy. I try to create as much of power equity, power balancing structures for sure. So these were a couple of examples that comes to my mind.
Yeah, thank you. And when you were talking about the genogram assignment, I my master's training was marriage and family therapy, and I've taken it and things like that. And it wasn't until I can't remember when, I think when I was teaching a class or I was doing something, because I haven't taught that class in years. But even a lot of the categories are very binary categories. So if you think about somebody who is gender expansive, it's very binary. But when you talk about the complexity of your students, I was like, wow, yes, that very well could be oppressive. And what about individuals who don't have that connection or are able to gather that information because their biological family they don't connect with anymore? Of course, they could do their chosen family, but part of the genogram is really noticing biological family patterns, not necessarily chosen. So being more open to navigating those patterns. So I think you highlighted like a good point. And when you were talking about with international students and your work around working with international students, I was thinking about there was a comment made by a woman who has been in the U.S. for, I think she said like 8 years, and she didn't realize she was Asian until she moved here. Like it wasn't, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, like you wouldn't. It's a social construct because you don't know you are Asian or a person. You don't, if you're in an environment where that's the norm, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it blew my mind because I was like, you're right. Like you would not realize it. And then I started to think about, wow, that transition and then being lumped into a category with or trying to be forced to be American. Well, I don't like saying American because American includes more than the United States, but United States culture, which even me thinking about stuff with saying American is like how minimizing that is to South America and Canada, like because they are North America, but we call it American when we think about the United States. And so that was something that came up. I was like, oh yeah, you're right. So you're just highlighting all of these things with like conversations or things that I've had in my experience, and all these things have come up within the past 6 months in conferences or workshops that I've attended. So thanks for highlighting those things again, because again, it's not, those experiences aren't necessarily part of my worldview as being, you know, someone who was born and raised and been here all my life. Some of it is similar, but some of those experiences I don't know. So it's up to me as an educator, a supervisor, and researcher to be more aware and cognizant of that and incorporate some of the things that you've, some of your examples and things that you've mentioned into those roles to ensure that my foundation continues to be from a multicultural social justice focus lens. I think that's what I meant to say, lens.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you for sharing your perspective and your vulnerability too, Dr. Bell. I really appreciate that. And then even your person, the individual who said, I didn't identify as an Asian until I came to the US and I was externally identified as an Asian. The grief and the losses, then the meaning too is attached. Like if you are an Asian, you need to be X, Y, and Z.
Exactly.
If you are so and so, you need to act like A, B, and C. So that is so traumatizing and so minimizing of individuals and their potential. So your example is very powerful, and yeah, thanks for your openness.
No, Dr. Valli, thank you for like just insight. And like I said, it's like, you know, these conversations, again, it's, you know, not part of my worldview. And I'm not saying I'm the most culturally there person or anything. I never consider myself an expert. And I strive to tell my students that we are always moving towards becoming more socially justice, multicultural. I don't even want to say competent, because competent, I'm starting to like pull away, because then competent means that that's the end point, and there's never, there's not an end point. So I tell students all the time that, yes, I'm affirming, I'm open, I, you know, focus on that. However, I even make my mistakes, you know, and not aware of things because it's not part of my worldview. You know, I have privileged identities. And I have to be on, and I own it, and I'm okay with that. And I accept that, but I'm intentional about the power that those privileged identities hold, and ensure that in my work, in my roles, should I engage in behaviors, I tell people, call me out, please call me out. I am okay with that because it's not part of my worldview. So I think the term that someone called it was cultural humility, which I didn't even know that's what I was doing. I had no clue until someone brought that term up, and I was like, is that what I've been doing all this time? Oh, okay. So, but basically that's what it is, cultural humility.
Right. And you know, it's not the absence of mistakes that makes us an anti-racist. It's acknowledgement of mistakes that makes
exactly.
us. Right.
Yes. Right. So, Dr. Valli, thank you for engaging in this great, informative, insightful conversation with me about multicultural and social justice, and how it influences and how you incorporate it in your work. I really appreciate you taking some time to me to have this discussion.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. No problem. And thank you again, and have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.